everybody. Thank you so much for participating in a little warm up with us. Thank you so much for participating in the conference so far and for sticking it out for this last presentation. I swear it will be worth it. We have with us today Sabrina Guzman Skotnitsky. Sabrina is a climate justice advocate, artist, consultant, and researcher residing on the ancestral and unceded territories of so-called Victoria. As a bisexual woman of mixed Mexican and European descent, intersectionality is an important focus of her studies, work, and advocacy. Over the past 2 years, Sabrina has worked with Youth Climate Lab, the Canadian Council for Youth Prosperity, and the Emerging Youth Consultancy on a range of projects related to climate policy, green jobs, just transition, and youth leadership. Through her report, Build Back Better, Expanding Green Jobs for Youth Post-Pandemic, which she's going to be talking about in more detail today, Sabrina advocates for the equitable and large-scale inclusion of young people in Canada's transition to a low-carbon economy. Currently, Sabrina is a master's student in environmental studies at the University of Victoria, specializing in political ecology. Thank you for joining us today, Sabrina. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. And I did want to elaborate a little bit on like the territories and lands that I'm joining in from today. I am calling in from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, namely the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, as well as the Wasanich peoples. And I am relatively new to these territories and just want to really express my gratitude to be able to study and work here. I'm very excited to jump into this presentation, and hopefully we'll be able to have some interactions through the chat or people sharing to discuss how we can support youth in navigating the challenges and opportunities of the environmental field. So for our agenda today, I thought we would start with a check-in and introductions in the chat. Many of you folks may know each other because you work together or have been in the conference together, but it'd be lovely for me to know where everyone is coming from. And I will have a slide next to ask exactly what I would like you to introduce yourself with. And we're going to start off with talking about what is a green job, because I think there's a lot of different conceptions and ideas about what defines a green job. And actually that is something that was a really key part of my research. We'll also talk about why green jobs for youth and why now, and kind of the political moment we're in. And then get into some of the research findings, but also hear from you folks about what barriers youth are facing or expect to face in getting a green job. And then again, talking about what came in the research, but also from your own input about how we might support youth in being successful in the environmental field. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A and kind of open dialogue if there's any other discussion points we feel like we want to expand upon. So for check-in and introductions, I would love to hear which lands and territories you're calling in from today. What is your role in supporting youth? If you're, for example, an educator, a mentor, a parent, or an elder, and if you are a youth yourself, would love to hear that as well. And what brought you to the session? And that could be related to some of the above questions, but it would be lovely to get to know, get a sense of who's in the room. Oh, and I will say that my connection with folks in Eastern Canada is through living in Chibuktuk for 3 years. And so I am familiar with some folks on the call, but also just in general have a deep love for that part of the country. And yeah, it's lovely to be invited to speak here. Awesome. I see people are starting to intro. And I can also share a bit more about my own story as well as an introduction. So as I mentioned, I live in Chibuktuk. I graduated from Dalhousie University in 2020, so right at the beginning of the pandemic. And like many other people, I struggled to find work and to kind of figure out what to do post-grad in the middle of a lockdown and all of the different trials and tribulations that we were all going through. And the first job I was actually able to get after that was one of these short-term work programs. And while it was a great experience, I got to work with the Nova Scotia Environmental Network. It was only a 2-week period, or sorry, 2-month job that was full-time. And so it was very intensive, and I loved the work, and the team and I worked well together. But because of the way the programs are structured, they can't rehire someone they've hired before under a different green job program. And because they didn't have the revenue themselves to hire someone else, I basically had to, it was tough luck, and I had to go find another job. And so this made me really curious about these federally funded green job programs and stuff like Canada Summer Jobs, which people might be familiar with. And that kind of leads me to the research that I ended up doing. So I was lucky to be able to get this fellowship with the Canadian Council for Youth Prosperity. And they are a federal nonprofit focused on youth workforce development. And at the time, I never really heard that term before. I didn't really know what it meant, but it basically refers to what are the supports, policies, practices, etc., that can support youth to develop their career, to figure out like what are their goals in life and how to enter the specific industries that they're interested in. And basically, to apply to this fellowship, I had to pitch an idea of a niche area that I wanted to research. And because of these experiences of having a lot of different short-term work experiences, but not being able to stay on with that organization because of the limited nature of the funding, I wanted to look at them to see how we could improve them. So in the end, it was about like an 8-month fellowship, and I was able to do research that included a literature review, 7 interviews, and a survey of over 250 youth across Canada. The 7 interviews included folks that worked in different federal departments, but also nonprofits, and also even an employer that had received these wage subsidies. At the time, I published this in May 2021, and it was 45 pages, and I felt somewhat obscure research. I had no idea if anyone would read it, but a year and a half later, or almost 2 years later now, I have done online engagements and workshops with hundreds of youth across Canada, spoken on multiple podcasts, and supported 2 other youth-led studies, which we'll discuss later on, and also helped start, and we currently still run, a LinkedIn Youth Green Jobs Network, which now has over 1,000 members. So this is really astonishing to me because I started off being in the situation of being this unemployed youth struggling to find work in the environmental field. And through this research, I've been able to help so many other people on their career journeys. And I'm very excited to talk to educators because most of the time I'm talking to youth directly, but educators play such an important role in all of this. So I thought it'd be great to start off by talking about what comes to mind when you hear the term green jobs. So if you could use the chat function again, that would be great. But this could be titles, it could be qualifications, could be job roles like tasks, specific tasks that you have to do, or perhaps even like competencies that you would need to get a green job. So I'll just take a look in the chat as people put that in. I see jobs that help to protect the environment. Do all jobs have the potential to be green? I think we'll definitely touch on that later. Jobs are careers that relate to the environment, including conservation, but sometimes also natural resources. Jobs that consider conservation, environmental monitoring, sustainable both for the planet and the workers. For youth, this can be seasonal work. A job that's focused on the environment in some way or another, whether by protecting the environment or being sustainable, not blue or white collar. Jobs that help improve the environment in some way. Yeah, and then someone said that they're skeptical if these jobs are really green and if they actually contribute to transition. Sustainable jobs that relate to the environment, work in natural resources, green economy related, knowledge of a variety of different science disciplines. Yeah, these are all really great thoughts. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a hot topic of how you define green jobs. And I thought, when I started my research, this will be simple. I'll just find one definition and I'll go off of that, and it'll be like in my introduction. And I started Googling, and there was all of these contradictory answers. And so this made me think, okay, well, then how, if you're applying to a program, how do you know how they define green jobs? And then I found out that each program on their website, they would say the requirements and stuff, but they often were different, requirements for different programs. And so when I started doing my interviews, I decided to ask each person how they define a green job. And so sometimes it was their personal definition, sometimes it was how their department defined green jobs. And again, there was overlap, but they were like important differences. And so then I decided, when I did my survey, to ask youth as well to define green jobs. And that's where I really got some of my favorite definitions. So my favorite one in the light green here says, green jobs are careers that focus on the creation of a more sustainable and just future for all. I really love this because it's talking about, let's look at what we want to create. What's the future we want to build? And then what are the jobs to help us get there, and then help us to sustain that future society and that future way of being. And it's really inclusive. It's including not only environmental scientists, engineers, and clean energy specialists, but also people who are progressive politicians or urban planners and community organizers. And so it goes beyond just jobs that directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also include those that indirectly contribute to environmental benefits, which I think is something that was said by one of you folks in the chat. So this includes both people directly employed within the environmental goods and services sector, regardless of occupation. So this could be someone who works for an environmental organization, but does communications or does their, I guess communications is the first example I think of, or art, or something that doesn't have an environmental credential associated with it. And then the second part is those requiring specialized environmental competencies, regardless of industry employer. So these are people that have those STEM qualifications, but for example, they could be working for a for-profit business that doesn't have an environmental goal, but they are doing the sustainable procurement, or they are making sure the building has more energy efficiency or something like that. And so there's actually quite an array of potential jobs. And there's also many jobs that are not what we typically think of as being green jobs because they don't involve those STEM requirements or those environmental competencies. And that's very interesting because I think a lot of people, at least the way I grew up, I thought, if I want to have an environmental job, I need to be good at science or I need to be good at math. And I was not good at those things. And so it meant that my journey was a bit more winding to get into the environmental field. And so there is a whole suite of wage subsidy programs. So I kind of briefly mentioned that earlier, but this is actually kind of more of a fuller description. And in my report, I have like a whole big chart of all of them that I discovered at that point. But basically, they're for organizations to be able to hire young people, which is usually defined from 15 to 30 years old, for short-term work placements in environmental roles. Most of these programs are funded through the Federal Youth Employment and Success Strategy of Employment and Social Development Canada. So while they're under the purview of ESDC, and that's where the money is coming from, it's actually administered by a group of different departments and agencies, including Environment and Climate Change Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and Innovation in Science and Development Canada. There's definitely more than that I've listed there. I think, there's also Colleges and Institutes Canada. And then it's delivered by partners. And so this means that it was kind of confusing to figure out the source of things because there's a funder, there's an administrator, and then there's the people who deliver the programs. And the people delivering the programs are not actually hiring people to work for their organization. They're then giving the wage subsidies to smaller businesses, nonprofits, etc. So there's a lot of different layers here, but the big delivery partners include Project Learning Tree, EECOM Canada, which is the Environment and Career Organization of Canada, and Electricity HR, BioTalent. There's many more, but these are some of the big ones. Environmental Career Organizations of Canada is probably the biggest one. They probably have at least 4 to 8 programs that they administer per year. And Project Learning Tree is great. They were one of the people I interviewed as well. So why green jobs? One important context for this research is that in April 2020, when I graduated, we saw the lowest NEET rate in 20 years for youth. And NEET refers to, highest NEET rate. So NEET refers to not in employment, education, or training. So it's the highest amount of youth not engaged in any of those activities. And so this was really concerning, as well as obviously the ones who were employed were in some of the most high risk industries. If you think about service, tourism, and so we're at the most risk to COVID exposure and had the most precarious work environments. And so I was really concerned about this, as well as knowing in my own personal experience, but from speaking to other youth, that there is a lot of climate anxiety. There's a lot of concern about our future, not just because of the COVID-19 crisis, but also the intersection of the economic crisis, the climate crisis, racial justice, all of these issues that feel like they're all hitting us together at once. And many people are in despair about our futures and unclear about what should we even do? Is anything we do meaningful? And so I find that this is really important in this current moment, not only because there are anticipated vacancies that are going to open up in the green jobs market, and there's also just going to be a lot more created. So there's going to be a need for workers in this area, but we also need to give youth a place to funnel our energy where we can feel like we are both supporting ourselves financially, but also contributing to making a better future and contributing to fighting the climate crisis. And so that's why I really feel like this is an important time to be supporting youth. And I think for a long time, a lot of us have been told, go volunteer, go take action, go lobby, go organize, which I think is really important. And I started off as a climate organizer, but that can really lead to a lot of burnout and a lot of, exhaustion if we're have to do our day job and then go and fight to try to save our futures. And so I really don't think that we necessarily need to choose between those two. Everyone's situation is different, but I think there's a way that they can come together. So I would love to open it up again to ask, what barriers do you think youth face or expect to face in entering and succeeding in the sustainability sector? And you can think back to when you were younger, if you are in this sector, but you can also just try to put yourself in another person's shoes that might be quite different from you, might be from a very, very different background, etc. So barriers to education due to finances, livable wages versus your personal values, not knowing which new jobs will be created, low pay, not enough experience, competitive nature and lack of access, finding full-time year-round permanent work, lack of opportunities or just a hard time finding opportunities, self-confidence, confidence in sciences and math, shift to gig economy, that's a big one. Imposter syndrome, oh, our lovely friend. The lack of political weight of the NGOs and community-based organizations. Transportation to remote jobs, many green jobs may not be in urban centers. Yeah, these are all great. These are ones I haven't heard before, so I love that. Uncertain funding to organizations. A global pandemic, yeah, just to throw that in. Awesome, thank you, folks. Living costs and relocation. Yeah, this is great. Folks have definitely identified quite a few that came up. So in the survey, I think I gave a few options of different barriers people could select. And then there was also open, if you have additional barriers you want to add that you've been facing. lack of long-term funding. And so basically what happened was one of the questions was to rank on a scale of like slightly difficult to extremely difficult. How difficult do you perceive it is to enter the environmental or low carbon field? And I was shocked to see that 64% of respondents ranked it moderately to extremely difficult. And one reason I was shocked was because I believe about 20% of the total respondents had already participated in green job programs. And so having already participated, there still was this really big perception of difficulty. The most common barriers youth listed were that they don't have experience in the green fields, they don't know anyone who works in the fields, they don't have the right degree or accreditation, and they're not good at or not trained in science, technology, engineering, or math. And so this was really interesting in the sense of that experience came out like is the top barrier, but also this idea of not knowing anyone who works in the field and how that kind of limits your idea of what's possible for yourself. And Project Learning Tree Canada, in a presentation I attended with them, they also identified these three challenges, which I think really intersect. So they talk about how youth don't know what a green job is, which comes back to this very vague definition of green jobs and how it's deployed by different organizations. They don't see themselves in a green job, and they don't know how to get a green job. And I would say number two is really important because it really speaks to the lack of representation for a lot of young people. I don't know about you folks, but especially when I was younger, when I would picture someone in a green job, I would picture a white man who's probably middle-aged with a like reflective vest and like a yellow like hard hat, who was doing solar power panel installation or working on a wind turbine or something like that. I didn't imagine someone who looked like me, or even someone, for example, who was like a woman of color in STEM, or an Indigenous youth doing art as a green job. Like that wasn't the kind of images I came up with. And so if you never see someone that looks like you, who's from your community, who has similar experiences to you, lived experiences, it's hard to picture that that's a possible route for you or career path. And so that's one reason why it's really important, again, to have these positions be more accessible, and so that it'll have a ripple effect, right? And so to speak a bit more to some of the equity challenges, as many of you folks probably know from experience, the environmental field has historic and ongoing practices and policies which exclude BIPOC youth, women newcomers, youth with disabilities, and youth from rural and remote communities. And there's quite a few reasons why that is, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but as some people highlighted, the high cost of education, especially to get into STEM degrees. And there's a lot of different reasons why you might not be able to go to university other than finances because of where universities are located. If you've never had someone in your family who's gotten a university degree, again, if you don't know someone who's done something, it's kind of hard to, again, imagine it's possible for yourself. And of course, the STEM field in general has excluded and discriminated against women specifically for many years, but also other groups of people. And if that's seen as the standard of what you need to get a green job, it can be very exclusionatory. The second one, which is probably one of the biggest problems that I've seen, is that there are immigration status requirements for the most of the federally funded green job programs. This is beginning to change now, but at the time, I think Project Learning Tree was the only program deliverer that I saw that had one program that allowed newcomers. So currently, most programs, you would have to have permanent status, citizenship, or basically legally recognized as a refugee in order to be eligible. But now some are opening up to allow international students and people on temporary work permits to apply, but that is still more rare and is a big issue given if you think about how Canada, we depend a lot of our a lot of our economy in general on immigration and projecting in the future, we're expecting to need immigration to fill a lot of labor market shortages. And yet we're not allowing international students who are already living here to gain some of this work experience. There's also the physically strenuous nature of jobs. Many of the ones that involve field work, installation, land restoration, etc., may not be accessible for many people with physical disabilities. There's also, folks who are neurodivergent. Some prefer remote work, but for some that is really difficult to have these jobs, especially during the pandemic, where you have so much screen time and stuff of that nature. And then overall, toxic work cultures premised on patriarchal and colonialist values. And I could go on about that forever, but I think we are familiar with different examples we've heard in our life. I think of, because I'm here in British Columbia, a lot of people go tree planting, and there's a lot of toxic masculinity in some of those spaces and competitiveness, but also thinking about, the colonial underpinnings of some concepts like conservation, this idea that humans are bad, so we have to keep them apart from nature, and not realizing the interconnection there. And so I wanted to speak a bit more to the challenges specifically for Indigenous youth. I was lucky to be part of this research project with 4R's Youth Movement, which is an Indigenous youth-led organization working on reconciliation from very many different viewpoints. And they've done a lot of amazing work, and we collaborated with them through Youth Climate Lab to create a audio blog series, also called Landing Back, which I'll definitely recommend to folks. But essentially, this policy brief was looking at how reconciliation funding and just the way we talk about reconciliation doesn't usually include climate work, even though that should be at the core of reconciliation, is restoring these relationships and enabling Indigenous peoples to fully be stewards of their own lands and territories. And so one of the big, barriers for youth is around this narrow definition of what youth climate action, volunteering, and green jobs looks like. So a lot of folks think of, young teenagers striking from their school. You might think of Greta Thunberg, but often we're thinking of upper middle class, white, privileged teenagers who decide to just leave school. We don't necessarily think of the Indigenous youth who are literally at the front lines of their communities trying to stop resource extraction. And we know that there is an overcriminalization and policing of Indigenous folks who are just doing this work to protect their lands and territories. And so this is like probably the most massive barrier that I can think of. And there's also a lack of access for Indigenous youth to green jobs and funding to support Indigenous youth-led climate action. One big problem is, I think someone said in the chat, around jobs that require you to leave your community or are far away. So that's a big problem, is a lot of communities in remote areas, they might have one big industry, and usually that's resource extraction. And so if a young person wants something different for themselves, they often are told you have to relocate for, a 4-month job program somewhere else, or maybe even permanently. And so this is a really big issue. And then overall, there's a tokenism of Indigenous youth in government, institutional, and nonprofit spaces. Increasingly, Indigenous youth are being sought out to give input on different, policies, practices, organizational strategy, etc. For reconciliation, but like for climate work, for a lot of different things. But if they're coming into this space that has these colonial values, that is, predominantly white or predominantly settler, they might not be coming into a safe environment that really values their opinions. And so a lot of people get burnt out from being in these situations. And this was especially shared in some of the audio blogs that we drew from. And you can think of, being the diversity hire whose thoughts are not really taken into account. And you're just kind of toted around as being the, to show that we have diversity in our organization. And the second report I wanted to highlight was through, again, through Youth Climate Lab. I was able to mentor two youth, Haruka Ayoma and Vanyartha, who are both, one is a former and one is a current international student. And they wanted to do research to further look at the challenges and barriers that international students and former international students have. And so they did a survey themselves as well. I believe they got about 90 respondents from across Canada, and basically had a bunch of different questions around what is the difficulty in getting a green job. And I really like this graphic because it shows the, I guess, what you call a positive feedback loop, or how these things are mutually reinforcing patterns of difficulty or patterns of having challenges entering the green field. And so if you start with this lack of permanent residency or citizen status and you can't get into a green job, and you basically, let's say you graduate, and so you've maybe worked other jobs, but not in the environmental field. You graduate, you apply for your PR, you get PR. Suddenly you're able to apply for programs or apply for jobs that you might not have been able to before. But that whole time, while other people your age were getting those green job experiences, you weren't. And so suddenly you're competing against them, whereas they had, in a sense, an upper hand. And so it kind of reinforces this pattern. So even when people do get immigration status, they have their PR or citizenship status, they're still having this catch up that they need to do to their peers. So I'd like to transition now to talking about how we can support youth to enter and succeed in the sustainability sector. So I'd love if folks can add in the chat their thoughts around that. There's no wrong answers. Sharing lived experience. Networking and youth summits. Getting more training as an org to better support youth. Let them know their options, guide them to resources and supports, especially with mentors, video interviews, etc., that they can freely access. That's awesome. Volunteer opportunities. Asking questions. Sharing positive stories and representation. Yeah, Project Learning Tree has a great few resources around different journeys that people have gone on. They also have like a whole Indigenous Voices guide, which highlights specifically Indigenous environmental professionals in forestry and kind of related industries. So yeah, PLT is great. They also have a mentorship program, but we'll talk about the role of mentorship soon. Ask them what supports, help they need or want, facilitate discussion with other youth. Programs that help them learn about careers like Princess Trust Canada. Princess Trust is also a great organization. Skills and projects at school that provide transferable skills. Oh, I see Danica linked the PLT Green Voices things, that's great. Awesome. I think I'm having a bit of a trouble with my chat function right now. Not sure why. Okay, here we go. I can't see my next chat messages, so I'm sorry if I'm missing something someone shared.
Do you want me to read some of them out, Sabrina, in the future, or?
Sure. It's just stuck at Danica's for some reason. I wasn't sure if there's anything after that.
I don't think so. I think
Okay.
Danica just commented on her previous comment with some resources, and that's why it jumped to the end.
Oh, okay, I see. Great. I just want to make sure I got everyone. And I see Eric's also said skills and projects at school that provide transferable skills. That's great. Again, similar to the last survey question, I asked, I had a bunch of different options that youth could select. And then I also had like a free form that they could add supports that would help them. But overwhelmingly, almost 50% of survey respondents selected work placements and internships as their primary choice, which I guess really underscores the value of these green job programs. Mentorship, credentialing and upskilling, and networking were also really important. And there were conversations I've had around how mentorship had been really difficult to find during the pandemic. And even when they tried to facilitate remote kind of situations with people, they would get ghosted by mentors and like never hear from them again. And so there were these kind of challenges. And relating to the credentialing and upskilling, folks felt like if they got a credential that said environment in the title or had a STEM focus, that could help them further in their job hunt. And so I provided a few recommendations here. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, and I'm sure you folks have things that you can add as well. But for educators and counselors, I recommend familiarizing students with the full range of green careers and pathways, including green job programs, mentorship opportunities, and educational experiences. And I will be sending around a green jobs link at the end of my presentation that basically has links to all of the green job programs, as well as a few different organizations that are great places to look for resources. Help students identify their niche. So how can they contribute their unique gifts and passions to making the world a more climate resilient and socially just place? Like I said, when I was in high school, I was like, oh, I'm not good at, science or math. Like, what do I do? And I ended up doing an undergrad degree in international development studies because I was like, that seems interesting. And, it's about like helping people. And luckily that led me to coming to the area of climate justice and understanding how, environment and development are interrelated and how climate change issues and social justice issues are interrelated. But at the time, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to use the things I'm passionate about to make the world a better place. But it was through, mentorship that I've had and different work experience where I got to try out different things that I was able to figure out where my niche is. Continue to integrate and valorize Indigenous ways of being and knowing into curriculum, including traditional ecological knowledge and two-eyed seeing. As I mentioned briefly in the discussion around challenges that Indigenous youth face in particular, is this kind of the cultural values and the ways we talk about, science and environment can be very alienating to Indigenous youth. But if you reframe the things that they know from their community and their duties and responsibilities that are quite innate around the environment and show them how traditional ecological knowledge is as valuable, if not more, than this Western, scientific knowledge, that can be really, fundamental and really encouraging, to help them see where they can bring their full selves and their culture and their lived experiences into a green position. And then because this is a personal area that I'm very personally passionate about, is around the mental health challenges students may be experiencing. I mentioned about climate anxiety, but there's also things like ecological grief. And I think we're facing a lot more frequent and intense climate impacts. And so recognizing that, green jobs are not a fix for these feelings, but they can help. They can help people feel more agency and power and control over their futures and feel like they're able to better protect and support their communities. But also that might not be the appropriate way for them to address that. And so there's other resources, climate aware therapists, for example, that can maybe help them as well. And I'll also include a link to some mental health resources later on. And then for funders, employers, and government, which is a big group of people, but sometimes they overlap. The biggest thing is around increasing the availability of low barrier jobs for youth in the green sector. So Ayoma and Vanyartha really underscore the importance of eliminating the immigration status requirements. But if that's not possible, or if you are able to then use an alternative funding source. And so, for example, if you are a for-profit business or if you are a social enterprise, you have a bit more freedom in not using a wage subsidy, and therefore you can hire people who might not be eligible for that wage subsidy. Working with Indigenous and remote communities to create and attract businesses and other new employers. This will be especially important as we know, hopefully we are transitioning to a low carbon economy and phasing out a lot of fossil fuels to ensure that communities where, you know, they've grown up and everyone they've known and everyone in their family has worked for the oil sands, for example, making sure that there are new things coming into their community, new opportunities, the appropriate training so that they can see a way forward without having to relocate permanently. And then removing or reducing education requirements and recognizing lived experience in job applications and employment programs. And so one great thing I've also seen that's changed since my report is that many of the environmental programs that had STEM requirements have now kind of opened up in the fact that they won't have any education requirement, or they will have like a BA or something like that, instead of needing, you need an engineering degree or you need, you know, computer science degree. But that is still not necessarily as common with job applications. And so what I would love to see more of is, you know, where you have a degree of this many years or commensurate lived experience or work experience, where people are allowed to show that like the things that they've learned growing up, for example, stewarding their lands is really valuable information and experience to bring into a work environment. And something that 4R's Youth Movement and Youth Climate Lab we identified was offering paid days off or barrier-free accommodation for youth to engage in climate-related volunteer work. So for example, you know, attending those big climate strikes, often, you know, it's students who are striking, but like people who are in jobs want to also support those kind of things. And then meaningfully including youth in the Federal Just Transition Act and associated climate change and employment policies. This is a bit more of a bigger scope, looking at the federal legislative kind of area right now. But I think this is really important because a lot of just transition discourse has been about how do we transition current fossil fuel workers into low carbon jobs. And that's really important. But if you think of current fossil fuel workers, many of them are that, you know, bit of an older age range, tend to be white men, tend to be a bit more privileged. And so how do we make sure that youth who have not even entered the green field yet are not being left behind and are given different options and alternatives? And how do we ensure that their voices are meaningfully being included in legislation? And that is all I have for you folks for now, but I would love to open it up to any conversation or questions that people have.
Thank you
And
so
feel
much,
free-
Sabrina.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, feel free to, if you want to unmute and verbally share a question, love to see people's faces as well.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
I have a question. Thanks, Sabrina. This is the second time I've seen one of your talks regarding this, and I always am able to take away a little bit, something a little bit different every time. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us and your findings. We've developed a program for high school students to initiate or inspire them to think about green jobs. And, you know, we often debate if we're doing it the right way, in the sense that we bring the idea that all jobs have the potential to become green, and looking at it at a, you know, a large scale, vast. We don't want to like pinpoint, too much and too a narrow field. And we keep debating if that's a good thing or not, because, you know, we want to, yeah, it's just, I would love to know your thoughts on that, actually.
What do you feel like are the challenges with narrowing it that you're finding? Or like what I would say, what's the drawback from opening it up? I would actually, that's what I mean.
Right. I think, you know, it kind of forces us to question a little bit more if that job is actually green, and then going back to, okay, well, what makes it green? Because it's kind of like a spectrum of, you could be green a little bit, you could be green, and you mentioned it before, I'm not wording this properly. It is Friday late afternoon, but it's again on that degree of green and the messaging that we want to give to high school students. So I don't know if that's clear.
Mhm. No, I think that's clear. Yeah, I guess like the only thing to be weary about is like greenwashing, right? Is like this idea of like, because like I don't know like green enough, but like if something is trying to say that it's really sustainable and it's not, that's where I'm more concerned. And I think what's interesting about green jobs is that the more something is labor intensive, the more it's inherently low carbon because you're using your own labor rather than technology, energy, et cetera. And so it's really interesting because I would argue that, for example, care work could be a green job. But some people are like, well, you're not directly, contributing to environmental benefits, but you're inherently not, you're not using a bunch of fossil fuels to do your job. So like, I don't know, it can get really nitpicky there, but I think if there are jobs that help youth feel a sense of purpose and contribution, and they're not like claiming to do more than they actually are, I don't see the harm in having that wider definition.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to put the green jobs resource list here. Please feel free to share this with anyone you work with. It's just a view only Google Doc that'll be up there. And people can definitely check that out. And I see Haley put a plug in for Clean Foundation. They are also on that list. Clean Foundation does a lot of great different leadership programs. Were there other questions?
I have a question, Sabrina. You did mention it briefly, but when you did your research, I'm just wondering about experiences of youth with disabilities and how that might too put them behind their peers, and then they have to work harder to overcome those barriers, and then they actually might age out of the system, the support system that's there. So I'm just wondering your thoughts or research around that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to really go down that route as much as I might have liked to. And with the survey, I don't know if that was information I collected, like demographic information to know specifically. But I have a friend who's doing a lot of good work in this space, and she has had her own experiences with someone with cerebral palsy, she did try to do field work. She came here as an international student and did a environmental technician certificate, and then realized like that it was not really possible for her to do these long work, field work segments. And so she kind of had to pivot and did a lot of volunteer work just to gain experience in kind of the communication side, and now works for the WWF as like a fundraiser. So it's really challenging. I wish I had better answers for you about that. This is an area that I would love to see people do more research on, and even with the reports that I mentioned, like that was research that I didn't get to do in the scope of my fellowship, but luckily I was able to help continue. So this is an area I would love to also support in some way. Awesome. I'm also going to put in the mental health resources here. So hopefully people can save those links.
Does anybody have any other questions? We still have time. If you have anything you'd like to ask Sabrina before we wrap up.
Yeah, I guess I'd love to hear also if there was anything as far as barriers or supports or any other comments people have of areas that maybe feel like you've experienced through your interactions with youth, but maybe didn't come up through the research. Marianne, did you have a question?
Bonjour, je vais poser ma question en français si vous êtes à l'aise. I'm going to ask my question in French if you're at ease. I'm wondering, from your experience, if you think, in fact, I want to add a little context. I work with the youth uh, as a mentor, and there's a lot of youth that are starting to get involved by participating in conferences, for example, international conferences or forums on water, for example. And I'm wondering if, in your opinion, is that a good way to start in being involved? Do we start by events such as those? Does it work? I'm not sure if my question makes sense, but
Yeah, no, your question definitely makes sense, and I appreciate you bringing that up because that's definitely one way I really got started getting involved was to go to conferences and learn from speakers, but also meet new people. I think it definitely plays a big role because you are able to start those networking. And like as you are going to different sessions, you're kind of broadening your understanding of different environmental issues. I would say the two challenges that I would kind of highlight. The first is around the accessibility of attending those conferences. You know, sometimes it's just like, oh, you have to miss a day from school to go attend and you can get your teacher's permission. But sometimes it's like travel costs, it's registration costs. There can be other barriers. And so sometimes it's challenging to like expect or to just keep suggesting that to youth and they might feel like a bit alienated from those spaces. And then I guess part two is like, I don't know if you're talking about this type of conference, but like if you're thinking about the big like climate conferences or the biodiversity conference that just happened in Montreal, there can be a lot of build up, a lot of hope and a lot of expectations going in. And you spend a lot of time applying fundraising to be a delegate to attend. And then there can be a massive letdown and, you know, disappointment and feelings of despair when certain, you know, goals are not met, when there's agreements that aren't come to by the parties that were expected. And so it can be really demoralizing for youth who do attend those. And so it's really kind of, there needs to be a balance around supporting them and like understanding it's important to engage in these like multilateral or even like smaller scale interactions with government or policymakers, but also helping them kind of manage their expectations and supporting them afterward and figuring out, okay, well, what did I learn from the situation that I can take forward in the future? And how can it help me make different decisions or do something different with my own career path? Because I think a lot of the times as a young person, especially in high school and stuff, I just thought like, okay, the government's going to fix everything. And when you kind of realize that they can't or they haven't been, it can be really, really scary to be like, well, then who do we trust? And so kind of building their trust in themselves, but also their communities and in organizations like the one you work with, that they're there to help them and support them is really important. And thank you so much for that question. That's great.
just thank you, it helps.
And I also have my contact information on the resource list. And so if anyone wants to add me on LinkedIn or send me an email, please go ahead. I'm always open to having conversations.